Hey everybody, Jeremy here. Today I want to go over 5 myths about resin 3D printing. And my goal with this whole thing is to hopefully dispel some of the bigger pain points or concerns or fears that newer people might have getting into this hobby that they may have read about or heard about online. So I'm here to tell you different things based on my experience that I hope will give you a little bit more encouragement to give this a try. Myth number 1. Resin 3D printing is extremely messy. Not really true. At least it doesn't have to be true. So let me give you a little bit of an analogy. Let's say that you were in a maze with a bunch of walls and I handed you a big bowl of soup and I put a blindfold on you and I said, hey, go find your way out of the maze. And I come back 5 minutes later and there's soup everywhere. It's spilled on you, it's spilled on the floor. Now, when I go up to you, would I say, hey, that soup sure is messy how it just got all over the place like that. Now, is it the soup's fault that it spilled all over the place? No, because the soup is just there in the bowl. It has no control over anything. The reason why the soup spilled is because you ran into walls that you couldn't see and thus you spilled the soup. So it's a similar thing with resin 3D printing. You have to know where you're going in order for the process to be smooth. Or take this other food-related analogy. Let's say you wanted to make a cake for a friend as a housewarming gift and you're going to make that cake inside of their new home. Problem is, you've never been in their house before. So you go looking for all of the things that you're going to need. You need a bowl, you're looking for a spatula, a spoon, a whisk. But since you've never been there before, you don't know where to look. So you're looking inside one drawer and you're going, well, not that, I need to get something else. And you look in another drawer, well, I got the little spoon, but now I need a big spoon. Where do they keep the whisk? Do they even have a whisk? Where are those outlets? Do I have enough space here on this counter? Are those eggs up there or are the eggs down here? You don't know. So you're just kind of walking around and you're just playing it by ear. But if you try to make a cake inside of your own house, everything goes a lot smoother because you know where everything is. You know your space limitations, you know what you're capable of. You've been in that situation a ton of times before, and making a cake is far less stressful in your own house than being in some place that you've never been to before. So it's a similar kind of thing when you're dealing with the messy aspect of resin 3D printing. So what you need to do is create a streamlined work process in order to alleviate the potential mess that you might have to run into. And that type of thing only comes with time, because in the beginning, just like that kitchen you've never been in before, you're going to get a little turned around, and that is going to last until you develop habits. And since humans are creatures of habit, we start doing the same things over and over again. And then once you create that sort of assembly line process for yourself, you will notice that the potential for a mess gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Case in point example, I made a video a while back, and that video was titled something along the lines of how much space do you need for resin 3D printing? And I go through the process of me getting a print and cleaning it and going through the whole process on a table that is 4 feet wide and 2 feet long. So check out that video, link in the description and a card somewhere above my head. And then that will show you that even if you have a little bit of space, having your process down cuts a lot of the mess out of it. And you'll see that contrary to some things you might have seen online, you don't need a huge pile of paper towels for every print that you make. A much more convenient way to handle the little drips that you are going to run into, is just to get a silicone mat. Because with a silicone mat, any drips of resin or IPA or water that goes onto that mat, it will not be absorbed. It'll just stay there, pooling on the surface. Then you can just take one paper towel, fold it over in one fold or two, and then just wipe it clean, and you'll be good. And I'm being dead serious about this. In that Iceman print that I made that was comprised of at least 24 individual prints in order for me to glue all that stuff together, throughout that whole process, I used 2 paper towels. Not paper towel rolls, 2 paper towels regular squares, and I used shop towels. Those are the best towels to use for resin 3D printing because they're very absorbent, and when they dry, you can just reuse them over and over again. And one roll, if you're efficient, can last you a very long time. So don't be put off by the mess. It might take you just a little bit of time to get the process down, but once you do, you are not going to have big spills and drops and just a disgusting workstation. No, get the process down, get your strategy down, and then everything will be very clean. Myth number 2, eco-friendly resin is friendly to the environment. It's not. It's not at all. Now, a lot of resin manufacturers are really leaning into the plant-based and eco-friendly side of things because that's where we're headed, you know? We want to help the environment, we want to preserve what we have here. So using products that are friendly for the environment, hey, it's attractive. It's a good way to sell stuff to people. But that doesn't mean that it's always true. Case in point, I'm going to take a look at some of this Anycubic eco-friendly resin and some of the claims that they make about the resin. But then we're going to see if they're actually true by looking at the all-important safety data sheet. Take a look at this. So let's take a look at this Anycubic plant-based resin. Now, they really talk up the fact that it's plant-based and therefore it is eco-friendly. So look at this here on this picture. It says that it's environmentally friendly with no VOCs, no BPA, and no harmful chemicals. And then when you look down at one of these bullet points, it says environmental protection and no peculiar smell. Using soybean oil as raw material, the source is green and environmentally friendly with ultra low odor, no VOC, no BPA, no irritating and harmful chemical substances, in line with EN 71-3:2013 safety standard. So if you were just looking at this and you had no experience with resin at all, you would figure, hey, this stuff is totally safe because it says so right here. But it's not. Always look for this. This is the safety data sheet for the Anycubic Eco Resin. And this safety data sheet is going to tell us exactly what is or isn't safe about this particular resin, because they say that it's eco-friendly, no harmful effects and all that great stuff. But then when you look down on this sheet, here are some things that you should definitely know. Take a look at some of these tags here: skin irritation, eye irritation, skin sensitivity, aquatic acute, and aquatic chronic. What does any of this stuff mean? Well, underneath these scary looking red labels, it tells us causes skin irritation, may cause allergic skin reaction, causes serious eye irritation, may cause respiratory irritation. And what about those poor animals in the ocean? Very toxic to aquatic life with long lasting effects. Here under section 7 for handling and storage, here's what you need to know for handling this environmentally friendly substance. Provide adequate ventilation. Do not breathe vapors. Avoid contact with skin, eyes, and clothing. Use personal protective equipment as required. So as far as hand protection, wear chemically resistant gloves. All right. Eye protection. Use suitable eye protection. EN 166 goggles. Wear suitable protective clothing. In case of insufficient ventilation, wear suitable respiratory equipment. It even goes into detail about the types of masks or filters that you should use when you are around this stuff. And it doesn't sound very eco-friendly to me. Here under section 12, it's the ecological information, which is very important for eco-friendly resin, except it's very toxic to aquatic life. Very toxic to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. That is very serious. So no, you should not be rinsing this stuff down the drain. It is not good for the fish. It even says right here under the disposal considerations, avoid release to the environment. As these labels here clearly show, and they all say dangerous for the environment. Myth number 3, you need to learn how to do manual supports. No, you don't. Now listen, this is not a dig at anybody who does their own supports, and for all of the people who have learned how to do their own supports and detect islands and do all this other complicated stuff. Complicated to me because I don't know how to do it. It's not a dig at that. Okay, because all knowledge is good, and being able to do those things just makes you more versatile overall, and it's really going to help you in your journey, especially if you decide that you want to start designing and supporting and printing things that you make yourself. If you're not interested in the whole design process and you just want to take a pre-made model and print it out for yourself, but that model needs supports, you don't have to stress out about, well, where do I start? Where do I go? What do I do? Because if you were like me, you started looking up supports. What are they? How do you do it? And you come across some forum threads and you come across some videos, and there's people who show you how to do it and they swear like you need to know how to do manual support. I never use anything that anyone else supports. I always do my own supports. Now, maybe in the past that was the way to go, but now slicing software has gotten better. Everything has gotten better. It's gotten easier. I have never used manual supports in anything that I've printed because I never needed to. Because the auto supports in Chi2Box, which is the slicer that I use, has been tremendously helpful. Okay, I'm telling you, I would estimate like 95% of everything that I've printed using auto supports has been successful. From little miniatures, 28, 32, 75 millimeter, to larger statues, to several pieces that went together to create a larger statue. I've always used the auto supports. And the only thing that I do is make sure that the model is at an angle. So for example, if it's a person kind of just standing straight up and he's on the build plate like this, I would tilt it. That's it, like a 45-degree angle or more. You might have to tilt it a little bit more depending on what the other limbs are doing to fit on your build plate if you got a smaller printer. But other than that, once I get that tilt going and I try to make sure that there's no part that's laying like directly flat on the build plate, I just go to the support setting and leave everything the way that it is. It's on medium supports by default. I just hit auto support and I take whatever it gives me, and it works. I'm sure that if someone were to manually support their figure the way that they want to, they're probably going to get a better result with less scarring, less, things that you might want to correct afterwards, and that's completely fine. But that also takes time. You want to get some stuff on that build plate and print it. The auto supports work. I'm telling you, I've printed so much stuff, and almost all of them were printed in Chi2Box using auto supports. So really, no matter what anybody else says, I am living, breathing proof that the auto supports work spectacularly well. So don't be put off by not knowing how to do your own supports, because the auto supports work. I mean, I know you don't have that knowledge that some of the old school people have, but that's what happens. Things change, things improve, they get easier. So you might as well just take advantage. Myth number 4, which will probably be another controversial one, especially for the veterans out there and the super detail-oriented people, is that you need to calibrate your printer for each different type of resin that you buy. No, you don't have to do that, at least not as a default, okay? Because again, speaking from experience, my own personal experience, I've tried that. I've gotten different resins and then I tried to dial it in, And what I ended up discovering was that switching all of those different settings and lift speeds and distances and exposure times ended up resulting in more failures and more frustration than I had experienced before. And when I just started to just go back to the default settings that were set up with the printer when I got it, didn't change anything. That's when I had some of the best joy and the most success and the most wins with Resin 3D printing. So I thought to myself, let me just go back to what worked and just take it from there, instead of assuming that things are going to be different and they're not going to work with a new type of resin. And that has worked out tremendously for me. I've done a handful of resin reviews on this channel, and every time that I do a resin review, I tend to put up on the screen what my settings are. And those settings, by and large, are exactly the same, with the exception of specialized resin like translucent resin or ABS-like resin, where I change the normal layer exposure time. But other than that, if it's just a regular type of resin, it's a slightly different color or it's just a different brand, but it's still gray, I just leave it the way that it's always been. And I've gotten some amazing looking prints out of that. And it's just great to be able to go through an entire bottle of resin and not have any failures at all. It's just something that would not have happened if I just started messing with the settings every time I got a new bottle. I want newer people coming into this hobby to not feel put off and intimidated by the thoughts of having to chase perfection with everything. And taking these little cubes with tiny holes in them in letters and saying that this little tiny imperfection means that you did something wrong. I mean, it can be really off-putting to people. It can be intimidating. It can make them not even want to do it because they're like, wow, tough crowd, you know? And it doesn't have to be that way, because really at the end of the day, most people aren't going to be able to tell if the face of your figure is overexposed or underexposed. They're just not going to know. And chances are, in a blind test, you probably wouldn't even know either. Maybe some people would, most people would not. So as far as trying to just nail down those perfect parameters every single time, when you have a successful print, odds are it's going to look good. You don't need a magnifying glass. We don't have macro lenses for eyeballs. It's going to be okay. All right. So keep your stuff at default and just see what happens. And if you start to get failures, then you can start to tweak things here and there to see what you can do to make it better. But don't feel like you have to change everything every time you get a new bottle of resin. And the fifth and final myth about resin 3D printing is that it's worse than FDM printing. And that's not true. It's not worse. It's just different. It's a different tool for the job. And it really just depends on what you want to do. So if you're really more into statues and figures, and maybe you want to paint things yourself, maybe you want to create your own tabletop army, things like that, then resin is going to be the way to go for the nicest quality, because the resin, the finish on those figures is just a lot smoother. You really don't have to worry so much about those layer lines like you would with FDM printing. Now, granted, some of these printers out there now, especially some of the more expensive ones, can make some pretty darn good looking figures. But overall, resin just gets the edge, But on the other hand, if you're looking for more functional parts, a greater variety of functional parts, things that can move, gears and wheels that can interact with each other, or maybe just things that you personally are going to interact with and get use of and handle every single day. Simple things like storage baskets and solutions for hanging things on your walls, or just something that requires a little bit more stability and a little bit more oomph to take a little more force without shattering into a bunch of cured resin pieces on the floor, then filament is going to be the way to go. As I look around this room, I'm seeing things that I printed out of filament that I wouldn't want to print in resin. I'm looking at these modular storage containers that I made with filament. I'm looking at this cool silhouette art piece that was made out of filament. I'm looking at this puzzle box that I printed for my kids that they can play around with, and that was made out of filament. Technically, I could have made these things out of resin, but I didn't want to. I thought that these would be better served and it would be a better idea. Just use the filament printer for those. So it just really depends on what you want to do. If you're not into the models, like all this stuff that you can see behind me and some of the things that you can't see around me, then hey, filament all the way. But if you want detailed models and maybe things that you're not going to really handle all that much, just every now and then, but you want it to look as smooth and as good as possible, then resin is going to be the way to go. And the trade-off for that is all the safety precautions and the streamlining that you're going to have to go through in order to make the resin 3D printing process more enjoyable for you. So those were the 5 myths that I came up with for resin 3D printing, and I hope I was able to alleviate any questions or concerns that you might have had about resin 3D printing. But I definitely want to know about anything that I left out. So what are some common things that you've heard about when it comes to resin 3D printing that you have discovered through experience that's not quite what it's all cracked up to be? Thank you all so much for watching. And if you want to see more stuff like this, let me know by leaving a comment and subscribing and liking and all that good stuff everyone on YouTube always asks for. So until next time, take care of yourselves, and I'll speak to you soon.